When we think of empires falling, we picture the dramatic battles, the invasions, the collapse of legions, and the assassination of emperors in their marble palaces. But while these events certainly played a role, the downfall of empires doesn't just happen because of attacks from the outside. No, the true rot starts from within, and one of the most destructive forces is always money. The fall of the Roman Empire wasn't just due to the barbarian invasions or political corruption. It fell because its currency collapsed. The destruction of its money system didn't just affect the elite or the rich, it had a far-reaching impact on every Roman citizen, from soldiers to farmers, merchants to slaves. And today, this lesson still resonates. It's a warning to every modern economy that thinks it can manipulate money without consequences. Let's start with the backbone of Rome's economy, the silver denarius. First minted around 211 BC, the denarius was pure silver, reliable and trusted across the empire. It was used to pay Roman soldiers, settle trades, and store wealth. This coin wasn't just money, it was a symbol of Rome's might and stability. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in the value of its money. But running an empire is expensive. Rome had to pay its legions, build roads, and fund wars. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire found itself stretched thin, facing threats from Germanic tribes in the north, Parthians in the east, and internal unrest. Tax revenues couldn't cover military expenses, and so, like many empires before and after it, Rome resorted to an age-old solution: debasement. Instead of raising taxes, which, as we know, was always an unpopular move, the emperors started to reduce the silver content in the denarius. The result? A coin that looked the same on the surface, but had far less value. Under Emperor Augustus, who ruled during Rome's Golden Age, the denarius contained about 95% silver. By the time of Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century, it was down to around 50%. And by the time Emperor Gallienus took power in the mid-3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. What was once a coin of solid metal had become a hollow disc of bronze coated in a thin layer of silver. The Romans could see the difference. As the value of the denarius plummeted, prices started to rise. What once cost one denarius now cost many. A loaf of bread, a barrel of wine, even basic goods began to cost more. The Romans weren't dealing with abstract concepts of inflation, they were living through it. The debasement of the currency destroyed the lives of ordinary Romans. Soldiers, facing rising costs of living, demanded higher pay. Merchants, seeing the value of the denarius erode, refused to accept it, preferring instead to barter or demand gold. The local economies that had once thrived on the stability of the denarius began to break down, and the more the emperors struck cheap coins, the worse the situation became. This was a vicious cycle, one that repeated itself time and time again throughout history. In the 3rd century, Rome entered what's known as the crisis of the 3rd century. From 235 to 284 AD, the empire suffered nearly 50 years of turmoil, constant invasions, plagues, civil wars, and economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell at an alarming rate, sometimes only lasting months before being assassinated. But underneath all the political drama, there was one clear issue: a financial system that had collapsed. Taxes were levied in coins that were worth less and less, leading to widespread unrest. Farmers, rather than paying taxes in worthless coins, abandoned their land. Trade networks fragmented as the currency lost all value. And the Roman government, in a desperate attempt to keep the system afloat, implemented drastic measures. Price controls were introduced, and citizens were forced into labor, but none of these measures worked. One emperor, Diocletian, tried to restore order. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, which fixed the cost of over 1,000 goods and services. Bread, grain, labor wages, everything was priced. But, as one might expect, this edict failed. Prices can't be controlled by decree when the currency itself is worthless. A black market exploded, and official trade nearly ceased. People learned the hard way: laws and prices couldn't fix a broken currency. Rome eventually abandoned the denarius altogether. Constantine the Great introduced the solidus, a gold coin with consistent purity, around 312 AD. This new coin helped stabilize the economy, at least for the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. But by the time the solidus was introduced, the Western Roman Empire was already fatally weakened. The damage had been done, and the denarius had hollowed out Rome's economic core. Armies could no longer be sustained, trade networks were shattered, and trust was gone. The fall of Rome was a long, slow unraveling, and the collapse of its currency was one of the sharpest threads in that unraveling. So, what lessons can we take away from this collapse? First, we must recognize that the destruction of currency is the destruction of empires. Just as Rome thought it could trick its people by issuing coins that looked the same but had far less real value, modern governments often think they can get away with printing money or manipulating interest rates without any repercussions. But the outcome is always the same. The people pay the price, wealth is destroyed, and trust erodes. Rome learned this lesson the hard way, and if we ignore it, we'll learn it too. History didn't stop teaching after Rome. Every major inflationary crisis since then has followed a similar pattern. Governments debase the currency to cover their costs, the elites protect themselves with real assets, and ordinary people are left struggling to survive. The Roman currency crisis is the earliest example of this cycle, but it's certainly not the only one. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the echoes of Rome's collapse are deafening. After World War I, Germany was burdened with crippling reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. The German government, desperate to meet its obligations, began printing marks to cover their debts, just as Rome had debased its coins. By 1923, hyperinflation had taken hold. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark before the war now cost over 200 billion marks by the end of the year. People carted wages home in wheelbarrows, and pensioners were left starving as their life savings evaporated. Just like in Rome, those with debts found them wiped out by inflation, while those with real assets, land, factories, foreign currency, emerged stronger. The money became meaningless, and economic despair gave rise to political extremism, ultimately fueling the rise of Adolf Hitler. Zimbabwe followed a similar path in the early 2000s. Facing economic collapse, land seizures, and rising debts, the Zimbabwean government turned to the printing press. By 2008, inflation had reached a catastrophic level of 89.76 trillion%. Prices doubled every day, and people couldn't even buy basic goods. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency and switched to using US dollars and South African rands. Once again, a government thought it could cheat reality, and once again, the people paid the price. But we don't have to look at the extremes to see the effects of currency collapse. Even in developed economies, the Roman pattern persists. Consider the United States, for example. In 1971, President Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, severing the last connection between currency and tangible assets. From that moment on, the dollar became a fiat currency, backed not by gold, but by the trust in the U.S. government. Over the decades, the temptation to overspend became irresistible. The debt grew, the money supply expanded, and inflation steadily eroded the dollar's purchasing power. A dollar that could buy what $1 worth of goods in 1971 could now buy a fraction of what it could have then. The lesson is clear. Money is not a tool to be manipulated by those in power without consequences. It's the lifeblood of an economy. When currency is debased or manipulated, when its real value is hidden behind the illusion of prosperity, the result is always the same: inflation, poverty, and the erosion of trust in institutions. What can we do about this today? First, understand that inflation isn't an accident, it's policy. It's the silent tax that has brought down empires for 2,000 years. Second, recognize that true wealth isn't found in paper money or digits on a screen. It's in real, tangible assets that hold value when money loses its worth: land, productive businesses, and essential resources. Third, never assume that stability is permanent. History has shown us time and time again that when money loses its value, everything else follows. So, what's the takeaway from the fall of Rome? The lesson is that money is not invincible.
it can collapse. It has happened before, and it can happen again. Whether it's Rome, Weimar Germany, or modern economies, currency crises have the same roots, and the consequences are devastating. The next financial collapse won't just be a local event, it will be a global ripple effect. If we are not careful, the next collapse will leave us just as vulnerable as the Romans, the Germans, and the Zimbabweans. History may not repeat, but if we ignore it, we'll feel its consequences all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.